We have been everywhere. From the highest peaks to the deepest fathoms. We have seen everything, from the smallest elements to the farthest corners of space. We have built empires, defied gravity, conquered the elements. We have cured diseases, made a heart beat again, made the impossible possible again. Who are we? We are humanity, and there is no limit to what we can accomplish together.
A few years ago, I had the opportunity to sit in and listen to a sermon series that a church in Atlanta, Georgia was doing, and a pastor named Andy Stanley was preaching, and the sermon series was called Who Needs God? And I found that series so helpfully mirrored like my experiences in life and my own search for God that I thought, man, lots and lots of people should hear this. And so a few years ago, I actually contacted them, and with their help, they gave me permission to use their series as a jumping off place, as a starting place to craft one of our own. And that's what I want us to do here as well. For the next 5 weeks after this one, so 6 total, we are in a series called Who Needs God? And we are partnering with North Point Church in Atlanta to bring this content, but I just think that it's incredibly helpful content. And so I hope that you'll really commit to either being here every week for these next number of weeks, or that you'll make a commitment to at least tuning in, catching out the podcast or the videos on our website or on YouTube to catch up, because I think that this conversation is a critically important conversation. When I was born into the household of a traveling evangelist, and his wife, my mom, she was a huge leader in our church. And so she literally had the church keys. Like, you couldn't get into the church unless you knew my mom really well. She had the keys to the kingdom, we called it. And therefore, I was attending church since like 9 months before I was born. And when I was about 7 or 8 years old, I made some kind of like profession of faith in Jesus. I said like, I want to give my life to Jesus. I want to call Jesus my Lord. And at 7 or 8 years old, you're somewhat limited in the way that you understand what it is that you're actually doing or saying or talking about there. But for as much as I could at that age, I leaned into that. Then at 13 and 14 years old, I had other experiences with God where I kind of had a renewed, doubled down interest and commitment, a more advanced understanding of what faith in Jesus was. And I became a leader in my youth group, and I led several like campus Bible studies at my school. By the time I graduated from high school, I had a reputation as being like the Christian guy on campus. I was that guy. And then I got to college. Having been born into this like Christian household, having chosen to put faith in Jesus early on. And then I even went to a Christian school, a Christian college, East Texas Baptist University. And some of you didn't even know that there were such things. But like that's, so you could kind of grow up and be insulated with one view of the world your entire life and make it to 18, 19, 20 years old and have never really had that view threatened or taken apart or challenged. And I got into college, a Christian college, but I began reading things in philosophy and science that started to make me have questions. I started reading the writings of people like Nietzsche and Marx and a number of psychologists like Freud and Jung. And I just started having all these questions. And when I brought these questions back to my small East Texas town to ask people who had lived there their entire lives how to answer these questions, I didn't get very satisfying answers. And I started having a major crisis of faith and wondering if any of this was real. I started to look into other religions, including just non-belief. What does it look like to just hold some kind of agnostic or atheistic position? And I went on this multi-year journey that eventually led me back into the Christian faith, actually. I found Jesus incredibly compelling, and you would hope that would be the case since I am the pastor of a church, but that's where I ended up landing. But by the time I came back to some of the beliefs that I had held as a child, like there was a depth there that wasn't there before. And it's hard to get to a depth without deconstruction, without taking apart, without asking those questions. And for many of us, we find ourselves at some point in our life, we realize that the strength of our childhood faith is simply not great enough to withstand the weight of our adult questions. And so when that happens, we get to this place where we start asking questions of that faith. And we finally start to ask things like, do we need God anymore? Is that something we actually need? Or maybe even greater, like, do we need religion? Is that something that we actually need? And for me, that was my story, and maybe you have a story that's similar, or maybe you're in the midst of it, or maybe you've already decided to walk away. And I've spent the last number of years, because of my own personal story, reading hundreds of deconversion stories and listening to deconversion podcasts and talking with friends who have walked away from faith. And here's what I've learned over that time. There's really no one who's made that decision, who I've talked to at least, that walked away from Christianity for reasons that had anything really to do with Jesus or the God that Jesus invites us to follow after. There were lots of other reasons, good reasons for walking away from faith, but those reasons didn't really have anything to do with Jesus. And our nation has gone through, I think over the last 20 years or so, a major struggle around what we believe around religious faith. You know, I remember I was in college, it was my sophomore year. September 11th, 2001, and the towers in New York City were hit. First, like the largest terrorist attack we had seen on U.S. soil. I didn't have a category for it. Many of you probably didn't either. I was talking to high school seniors last year and realized that all of them had been born after this actually happened, which means we are old. And so for some of you, like you were born after this, and for some of you, you were alive during it. And I'll bet if you were alive during it and you were 5 years old or older, you probably remember exactly where you were when you first heard about it. You probably remember something of the way it made you feel when you first heard about it. And I remember there were some pastors who I was talking to, and Andy Stanley and North Point Church certainly believed as well. Like, you know what? This coming Sunday, church attendance is going to be higher than an Easter. And it was. The first Sunday after September 11th, 2001, the churches were completely packed out with people. The second Sunday after September 11th, 2001, the churches were completely packed out with people. And lots of people started to ask questions about their life and eternal life and whether there was a God and why this could happen. And so they gathered together in Christian churches all across the United States in order to look for answers. The third Sunday after September 11th, 2001, right back to normal. Churches that were full before the terrorist attack were still full afterwards, but churches that were empty before the terrorist attack were empty after that third week. People walked into the churches looking for answers, but they didn't necessarily really find them. Now, around this time, a gentleman by the name of Sam Harris, he's a neuroscientist, was starting to write a book, and he wanted to write a book that was essentially against religion, and not just like extremist versions of religion that can lead to things like terrorist attacks, but really against all religion in general. But he had to take it to 12, 13 publishers before it finally got published, because a lot of these publishers were feeling like, look, there's a resurgence of religious fervor in this country. People are trying to get back to some of their religious roots, and I don't think we want to publish a book that's going to challenge that. That doesn't seem like the direction we want to go. So finally, the 13th publisher ended up publishing his book, The End of Faith, subtitle, Religion, Terror, and the Future of Reason. The book went on to spend 33 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. People all over the world found it compelling. And this book wasn't about specifically Christianity. It was about all faith and all religion. But it got such a backlash in the United States, right? When you challenge someone's religious convictions, oftentimes they will get a backlash, especially Christians. Why? Well, because I've noticed about us Christians, we're thin-skinned. And then secondly about us, we have the megaphone here in this country, right? Christians have had a privileged position in this country for a very long time historically. And so if you start to challenge the belief of a large portion of the population, you start to get some backlash. So he actually wrote a follow-up book to this in 2006 called Letter to a Christian Nation. And this book also sold just lots and lots of copies. And if you're a Christian who is kind of like barely a Christian, maybe you go to church regularly, but you've never really wrestled with the hard questions of your faith, this book felt like a devastating blow to your faith. He brings up a lot of excellent points that Christians need to wrestle with. That same year, 2006, another book came out written by scientist Richard Dawkins. That book was called The God Delusion. And in case there was any doubt about what Dawkins was hoping to accomplish in this book, he tells us right up front, and he says this, and if this book works as I intend, religious readers who open it will be atheists when they put it down. Well, I appreciate the sincerity there. Like, he's going to tell you exactly what it is he's hoping to accomplish with this book. That same year, a writer and thinker by the name of Christopher Hitchens also released a book, and it was called God is Not Great. So in 2006, you had Harris, Dawkins, and Hitchens releasing these massive bestsellers. These guys became rock stars. This was also about the time that YouTube was really gaining in popularity, and enough people had broadband internet to start watching lots of videos online, and they watched these guys debate other other atheists and also debate Christians and Muslims. They watched them have roundtable discussions. These guys filled up university halls all across the country. And their message was not that Christianity is the problem or a particular type of religion is a problem. Their message was not that religious extremism is the problem. Their message was that religion is the problem. Like, of everything that we have going on right now, the problem is religion. Now, what this did not lead to was some kind of huge uptick in atheism all across the country. That didn't happen. But what did happen was an acceleration of a trend that had already begun. And that trend was that increasingly more and more people were just detaching from faith altogether. Like, they hadn't actually chosen atheism. It's not that they found atheism to be super compelling. It's not that they wanted to like fly that flag and run after that and proclaim that that's where they were. They just found the faith that they grew up with unattractive, not compelling enough. And so when research firms started to do research across the country and send out surveys and ask people what their religious affiliation was, increasingly people weren't checking off, some version of Protestantism or evangelicalism or Buddhism or Judaism or Islam. Like, increasingly people were just saying, like, I'm not affiliated. I have no affiliation. They started calling these people the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. They have under their affiliation, they have none affiliation. The spelling is really important, or it can get kind of confusing as to what you're talking about, but these people were called the nuns. They have no particular religious affiliation. Now, they're not angry, right? This group of folks is not angry. In fact, if you want to describe them, you say they're not hostile toward religion. That's not quite where they are. They're just not affiliated with it. Not hostile toward it, not affiliated with it. They're just kind of like, you know what? I grew up in a tradition. I'm not sure what I think about everything right now, but it just doesn't feel like it's for me. I'm just not affiliated anymore. Latest surveys would show that somewhere between like 25 and 30% of the country would probably fall into this category. And while a lot of times we think like, oh, it's all these young people, it's true. There are more people in the millennial and Gen Z generation. That range is probably between 35 and 40%. Than there are in older generations. You need to know that you can't tell for sure that someone is a nun just because of their age. There are lots of people who are middle-aged or older that would fall into this category. Now, for some of you, even finding out that this is a category is actually really good news today, because you weren't sure what you were before today. Maybe you still go to church sometimes, you still show up, like you have lots of family members or friends who might consider themselves religious or are part of a Christian church or some other type of church, but you just haven't felt that connected to anything. And now you know, and you can have conversations with people. You can tell them, like, I'm a nun. That's what I am. I'm a nun. I'm not hostile toward it. I'm just not affiliated with it. Some of you, on your way out of here today, after we're done, you might be able to turn to the person you rode with, a friend, a family member, your spouse, and just like be able to tell them, like, I'm a nun. I realized that today. That's where I'm sitting. I'm not hostile toward it. I just don't find it appealing anymore. I just don't long to connect with you. Some of you, your parents have been worried about you, right? For years now. They've been stressed out because of where you fall on your religious beliefs. And you can call them up and they say, like, Mom, Dad, don't worry about me. I'm a nun. I mean, the spelling, again, very important when you tell them this. But like, I'm a nun. That's where I'm at today. I'm not hostile toward it. I'm not affiliated with it. Don't ask me a lot of questions. Like, I'm still working it out. This isn't a position where people have like fought for years to figure out where they stand on things. They're just not that drawn toward it. Like, you might say, like, look, the one thing I know is religion and the God I was presented with as a child have lost their appeal. That's where I'm at. I'm a nun. So, today, I want to just identify this problem. If that's you, it is the church's fault. If you have found yourself drifting away, and that the faith you were handed as a kid like just doesn't resonate with you anymore, I think it is the church's fault. It's people who like do what I do. It's pastors, people like me. It's our fault. Why do I think that? Because I know for sure that in the first century, like if you read through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, this theme that you will encounter over and over and over again is simply this, that people who were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus. And so following September 11th, 2001, our church is filled up for several weeks, and people were asking big questions that Jesus has been answering for 2,000 years, and they still walked away. It's the church's fault. It's not that people find Jesus less appealing. They find our version of Christianity, the version of Christianity that they were handed as a kid, or maybe as a young adult, they just find that less appealing. People who were nothing like Jesus, liked Jesus. So today, I want to talk about being an atheist. Atheist 2.0. These guys, Hitchens and Harris and Dawkins and others, they have kind of like updated atheism for us to understand what it is. And so today, I want to just spend some time talking about what it would actually mean to walk away from Christianity or from religion in general and to walk towards something different. Because here's the reality. You can't move away from something without moving towards something else. And so if you find that you're just feeling like not affiliated anymore, like not connected, like you're in this none category, you may think like, well, I'm not an atheist. That's not really how I think of myself. And that may be totally true. But the reality is if you're moving away from religious belief, you are moving towards something else. And that thing that you're moving toward is atheism. And so I just think it's helpful for all of us to understand what it is that we're moving away from, which we'll talk about a lot next week, and what it is that we're moving toward, which we'll talk about this week in Atheist 2.0. Because, right, if you're saying like Christianity is not for me, I don't think that the faith that I grew up with is actually that relevant anymore, that means you are necessarily going to be running away and towards something else, right? And that something else could be a different religious belief, right? It could be that you're running toward Judaism, or that you're running toward Islam, or that you're running toward New Age spirituality, or that you're running toward the religion of CrossFit. There's all kinds of options here. What I'm saying is you're definitely moving away from something, meaning you can't move away from it without moving toward something else. So my goal today is not to prove to you that God is real. I don't think that would be possible, actually. And my goal to you is not to prove that atheism isn't. I don't think that that's probably possible either. My goal, and I have an agenda, I do have an agenda, obviously, is to just try to put out what it is that you would be moving toward, and first to just consider it. Like if I'm moving away from Christianity or away from religion in general, like what am I moving toward? And let's just consider, like, is that what I want to move toward? Because I think it's hard to make those decisions unless we have clarity around what it is specifically that we're moving toward. Here is what atheism is. Like if you're going to be an atheist, 2.0 version, a thing that you just need to realize is that atheism is a complex belief system that logically leads to some unsettling conclusions. Now, there are lots of people who would define Christianity like this as well. But I just want us to note, and I think these atheists would agree, that there is a system of belief that's involved in this, like a system of belief, whether that be in science or anything else, and we'll talk about that in a moment. It is a complex belief system that logically leads to some unsettling conclusions. Now, that word unsettling is not a truth test. Just because something is unsettling doesn't mean it's false. Just because something is unsettling doesn't mean it's not true. For instance, this year's Los Angeles Lakers, right? They have gone back and hired every player who was good 10 years ago who was played in the league, right? That's the team. Lots of people don't realize this, but the average age of the average Laker this year is 78 years old. So, is that unsettling? Yes. Is it true? Yeah, it's true. I'm really sorry about that. In fact, I really want my kids to go to a Lakers game this year. I want to take them because I would love for them to see all the players who were good when I was their age. And so I'm trying to figure out, like, when do I take them, right? Do I take them, like, in the first few weeks of the season? Because they won't have gelled by then, probably. They probably won't be playing at their best. But if I wait till, like, February or March, half these guys are going to have blown out their ACL or their Achilles. So it's a personal problem in our household that we're wrestling with. But I thought you should know about it. Okay, so just because something is true, or just because something's unsettling doesn't mean it's false. Doesn't mean it's not true. So when I say that atheism is a complex belief system that logically leads to some unsettling conclusions, that doesn't mean it's wrong. So today, I'm not trying to disprove atheism. Like, that's not what we're going to do. I just want us to put out there what it would mean if you were to follow after it, if you were to think that that's the way that the world works. And thankfully, we've had these guys clarify this for us. So I want to list like 6. There are lots more. I'm going to oversimplify a little bit, but I'm going to list 6 pillars of atheistic belief and where it leads to, just for us to consider it this morning. Okay. So number 1, Atheist 2.0, the illusion of mind. The illusion of mind. So for lots of us, we have some kind of understanding of human beings as being somehow more than just biology. Like I have a body, but also there's some kind of mind or spirit or soul that's a part of the essence of who I am that would actually make human beings different than other biology on the planet. But if you actually believe that there is no God, and all of this is simply natural selection with nothing else interfering or guiding that process along, then the conclusion you have to land at is that we just have more complex and less complex different types of biology around here, and that you are just you. Like there's no you in there. You are just your body. Christopher Hitchens, as he was dying of esophageal cancer a number of years ago, he actually wrote down some musings. So he was thinking through that, like from his atheistic perspective, like what he was going through. And those were published after his death in a book called Mortality. And by the last chapter, I believe it's chapter number 8, by the last chapter of this book, as he's writing, his thoughts are in like sentence fragments. He's not even able to like form. He was an excellent writer. He's not able to form these amazing paragraphs that all hook together anymore. And this is what he says in the last chapter, toward the top actually, of the last chapter in his book. He writes this: "Always prided myself on my reasoning faculty and my stoic materialism. I don't have a body. I am a body." In other words, like, his doctors would say things like, Christopher, we're hoping that your body reacts well to this medication, or your body is failing you, and we hope that it goes this way. And he's saying, like, no, I don't have a body. It's not like there's something else in here that's not just my body. I am a body. And then he goes on to talk about how difficult it is to actually live like that is true. He writes this: "Yet I consciously and regularly acted as if this was not true, or as if an exception would be made in my case. I don't have a body, I am a body." So if you believe that there's no God, and that there's nothing guiding any of this, like the conclusion you're left with is that you don't have a body, you are a body. You are just simply biology. And that may be true, but it's a bit unsettling, and as Hitchens pointed out, it's really difficult to live that way. To just think of yourself as biology and the people around you as biology, and all of it basically equally important or not important. You're just biology. So that's the first idea behind atheism, the illusion of mind. Number 2, the illusion of free will. For lots of us, we believe, right, that we make the choices in our lives. In fact, personal responsibility is kind of built on this idea that I make the choices in my life. And there's environmental things, and I get shaped by things, but at the end of the day, I choose, right, who I marry, or where I go to school, or if I marry, or if I go to school, or what vocation I jump into, or if I become, an Instagram influencer. I get to make all of those different decisions. We think that there's some kind of free will at work there. And yet, what atheists would tell us over and over again is because you are just biology, your future is actually determined. That you don't actually, those things that feel like choices are not actually choices. You are a product of your environment and your biology, and that's it. In fact, Sam Harris, the neuroscientist who wrote the Letter to a Christian Nation book, Sam Harris was on his podcast a few years ago, and he was complaining about his critics. He was like, they misquote me, and they don't understand my arguments well, and he's complaining. And then he kind of stopped himself, and he said, I guess I shouldn't be upset. They have no choice in what they do. Similarly, brilliant scientist by the name of Stephen Hawking, who wrote lots of books that even I can understand about black holes and quantum mechanics. He wrote a great book called Black Holes and Baby Universes, and he's a determinist also. He believes that you are a result of your environment and your biology, and that's it. And then he makes this fascinating statement in this book. He says, "I have noticed that even people who proclaim that everything is predestined, like he does, and that we can do nothing to change it, look before they cross the road." Right, so it may be true that we don't have any free will, that we are simply products of our environment and of our biology. That may be true. But it's unsettling to think that it is. And, as Hawking points out, it's really tough to live like that. It's very difficult to apply that belief to the way that you actually interact with the world. So, the illusion of mind, the illusion of free will. Number 3, the illusion of value. The illusion of value. This really is about justice and how it is that we see what is right and what is wrong in the world. And the truth is, if we're just biology, if there's no moral center to the universe except survival of the fittest, if that's all that there is, then there is no overarching, transcultural understanding of justice or goodness. In fact, if that's the case, then justice is just what we want it to be. It's just what we want it to be. Which means that some of the things that we've heard over time that have maybe inspired us or filled us with hope and awe would just be completely inaccurate if there is no God, if there's nothing driving the moral universe. For instance, Martin Luther King Jr., he had this wonderful quote in his fantastic speech, Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution. He says this, many of you will be familiar with this: "We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." In other words, he had this idea that lots of civil rights activists have had over time, and lots of people who just want to see other people be able to get and live a better life have had over time, which is that, look, we're not perfect right now. There's lots of ways that we've maybe made mistakes so that we aren't going forward. Not everybody gets a fair shake at the moment, but we believe that the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends toward justice, which means these problems may not be solved in a generation or 2 generations or 3 generations, but over the course of history, we are moving in such a way that eventually wrongs will be righted, justice will be served. It's actually the Christian story that says that Jesus will return, God will wipe away every tear, he will right every wrong. Like, that's the way that time is moving, because that's where God wants it to move. But if there is no God, there is no justice, because justice is just what we want it to be. What's interesting about this to me is that we live in this pluralistic society where lots of us are comfortable saying, like, well, you do you and I'll do me, and your truth is great, and it's your truth, and my truth is great, and it's my truth, and you believe the way you want to believe, and I believe the way I will want to believe. And it's easy to say that because it doesn't really cost us much for someone else to have their own belief set. Really think in their heads, like, that doesn't change much about us day in and day out. Here's what you never hear. I've never heard anyone say, well, you have your view of justice, and I have my view of justice, and we'll just have our separate views of justice. No, when people feel like a moral wrong has been done in the world, they want to see that wrong made right. They want to see justice served. And what's fascinating, right? We live in the United States, and so the political spectrum here, there are people on the far right that have a slightly different value system than people on the far left, and both are really happy to be involved in cancel culture whenever you cross someone on their tribe. They're both very happy to cancel other people who do an injustice. They just think about those ideas of justice differently. Because while we're comfortable with saying, you do you and I'll do me, it's also true that we want to say, like, I want you to be accountable to my sense of justice. When something is wrong in the world, I want to see it made right. People are less comfortable having a lot of wiggle room around this particular issue. And yet, if there is no God, if this is not a moral universe, if we're just simply biology, then justice is just what we want it to be. Their value is an illusion. Now, that might be true, but it's unsettling if it's true. And it's really hard to live that way, right? It's really hard to live that way. In fact, you can live as if there's no values and there's no moral center to the universe, but if you do that, your biology is likely to be locked up by other biology, and then they will take away the freedom that you never had. So it's really hard to live that way. Number 4, something came from no thing. I'm actually going to go through these last three fairly quickly, because these will be the ones that are more familiar to you probably. Classical atheism. Something came from no thing. In other words, why is there something in the universe instead of nothing? Why does anything exist? That is the question, and it's not one that people have really figured out a way to resolve outside of possibly something creating these things. In fact, Richard Dawkins has said this, that cosmology is waiting on its Darwin. Now, it may be true that we just don't know, and we'll find an explanation somewhere that has something not to do with any kind of God at all. That's totally possible, but it's hard to live that way, and it's a little unsettling to think about it. So something came from no thing. Number 5, first life emerged from no life with no help. So it's not just that there is something instead of nothing, but it's that it's these things in particular. Like, I'm a being, right? A biological being. I'm jiggling my vocal cords right now that's like moving the air in the room, and you're hearing it in your ears and you're hearing it online because of that. Like, there's biology and technology that human beings were a part of developing that's making anything that we're participating in today possible. That's wild. And there's this idea that the first life emerged from no life with no help, and we actually have no idea how that would be possible. There's not a lab experiment we can do and figure out, like, how would life just generate, just start up? We really don't know. Now, that may be true. It may be true that first life originated from no life with no help, but we certainly can't explain it or even come close to begin to explaining it. And it's a little unsettling. And then finally, number 6, natural selection is responsible for all life after first life. Now, we're going to talk a lot about science next week, actually, because unfortunately, there's been versions of Christianity that have essentially told people, if you want to follow Jesus, you got to check your brain at the door. So, you have to be super skeptical of science and all kinds of smart things. No, like I don't think that that is true. And I think that there is massive amounts of evidence for some version of evolution and natural selection. There's massive amounts of evidence for that, for the universe being 13, 14 billion years old. There's tons of evidence for that. We'll talk about that more next week. So this is not, for me, an argument saying like, oh, natural selection has to be tossed out for Christianity to be true. It's just this idea that natural selection is responsible for all life after first life, that's the scientific, that's the atheistic thought. And when you actually read these guys and they talk about natural selection, the way they talk about it is fascinating. Richard Dawkins, right, who wrote The God Delusion. Richard Dawkins, a few years ago, I read this quote, and it was a mind-blowing quote. I think he does the best job of explaining natural selection probably that I've seen anywhere. So I just want us to, this is probably the longest quote that I'll share with you this whole series, but I think it's important for us to get it all. So this is what he says. Dawkins writes, think about it. On one planet, and possibly only one planet in the entire universe, molecules that would normally make nothing more complicated than a chunk of rock, they gather themselves together into chunks of rock-sized matter of such staggering complexity that they are capable of running and jumping and swimming and flying and seeing and hearing and capturing and eating other such animated chunks of complexity, capable in some cases of thinking and feeling and falling in love with yet other chunks of complex matter. That's natural selection. He essentially goes on to say, we now understand essentially how the trick is done. Now, if you take God completely out of the equation, you are left with only natural selection. But here's what I've noticed. I think it's important. Now, keep in mind, I have a degree in world religions and theology, not biology. So I just want to confess that up front, all right? I'm not going to compete or debate with you. These guys are really smart. I'm not here to like argue with them. I just want to tell you something that I've noticed as a Christian pastor who's read a lot about this. Anytime I see someone like Dawkins or somebody else talk about natural selection, I find that they really struggle to do so without framing it as an invisible force at work in the universe with an agenda. Like, it's very hard to talk about it simply in terms of nature without it sounding like there is an invisible, volitional, willful direction that the universe is headed and natural selection is taking it there. So, it may be true, but it's unsettling and it's difficult to pull apart how, in fact, it would be if all we have is natural selection with no creator guiding a process or pushing something into it at all. Like that's just difficult to see how that would be true. It's unsettling. It may be true, but it's unsettling. Now, here's what I suspect is true about you, whether you're in this room or you're online. Here's what I suspect is true about you. What I suspect is true is that if you find yourself moving away from faith in God, moving away from Christianity, moving away from any kind of religion, let's be honest, it probably has almost nothing to do with any of this, right? This is probably not the reason that you're moving in that direction. Now, maybe you read a book by one of these guys or somebody else that got your mind jogging and got you thinking, but probably the reason that you've actually chosen to step away from faith, or the reason that you're in the process of stepping away from faith, is not actually about all of this stuff, probably. But for some reason, you have simply not found faith to be compelling anymore. You have not found Christianity, those of you who grew up Christian, you have not found Christianity or faith in Jesus to be compelling anymore, or as a solution to a problem that you actually have, or as a way forward that you can actually see yourself engaging with. And so my hope over the next 5 weeks after this one is to just show us that perhaps if you find yourself in a place where you're saying, that you've lost or you're losing your faith in God, that maybe you were handed a version of God as a child or as a young adult that's not actually the version of God that Jesus invites us to follow. That your problem may not be that you find atheism incredibly compelling. Maybe as we were talking through that just a few minutes ago, you were thinking like, well, I'm not sure that I believe that. I don't know that I want to go there. I don't know that that really is compelling. It's probably not that you think atheism is just really, really compelling. My guess is the reason that you don't find your faith as compelling as you once did is probably because, and I know this may sound arrogant, but it's probably because you were following after the wrong God. So next week, we're going to look at the gods of the No Testament. The gods that we were often handed as a child that I think actually have no basis in the scriptures or in what Jesus invited us to follow. And here's what I know. It could be possible, right? It could be possible that the atheists have it right, that we in our minds, like, right, we don't actually make free will decisions, that our mind is just, it's not true, it's an illusion for us. It could be possible, right, that our interaction with other people is all just determined by our biology and by our environment. It could be possible that no life, that life came from no life for no reason. All of that could be true, but here's what I'm guessing about you. I'm guessing that you hope not. I'm guessing that you hope that there's more. And I hope that we are more. And so I would love for you to come back next week as we discuss the gods of the New Testament, because my concern, my fear, is that for some of you, you've walked away from faith because you were never given the right understanding of God. And that if you could just grasp the God who Jesus invites us to follow, it might change everything for you. So who needs God? Perhaps nobody. Perhaps everybody. Perhaps we should talk about it. So I hope to see you here next Sunday as we jump into that. And we're going to do something that's a little out of character for us this morning. I want you to be thinking about this as you leave and as you go to lunch, and I want you to be talking about it and thinking through it. And so you are dismissed. Have a wonderful day. We'll see you next week.